Hello again, everybody. Welcome to our Chapter 3 lecture series, Creating Anglo-America, 1660 to 1750. The focus question for this first section is, how did the English Empire in America expand in the mid-17th century? Now, the English economy at the time was structured around an idea called mercantilism, which is very closely associated with that idea of zero-sum economics that we discussed during our Elements of Historical Theory lectures. Essentially what mercantilism was government-regulated manipulation of trade that ensured more gold and silver entered the mother country than was exported or remained to the colonies. The colony's specific role in this system was to supply raw materials to the mother country, which manufactured them into goods, and then the colonies were to buy these imported manufactured goods from the mother country, ensuring that all of the profits remained within the empire itself. The policy of mercantilism was enforced through the Navigation Acts that we discussed in the last lecture series. Essentially what the Navigation Acts entailed were that colonial exports had to be shipped to English ports in English ships, and imports had to be shipped through England before they could then be dispersed through to Europe or any other point on the globe. The government of England collected revenues from taxing this trade, and the Navigation Acts benefited both English merchants and the shipping industry. Now, American ships at this time were considered English, and particularly in the New England states, a large shipbuilding industry developed that supplied, at one point in time, over half of all the ships in the entire British fleet. Although the Navigation Acts were meant to support and enrich the entire English Empire, the English merchants at home by far benefited more than did the colonies. And this created some tensions amongst the American colonies over these Navigation Acts, particularly over Caribbean trade. Now, trade between the North American colonies and the Caribbean by this time had become very lucrative. The Caribbean economies were very much focused on sugar and other staple crop production, so they produced very little foodstuffs or other necessities that they needed. So they imported most of that sort of thing from the North American colonies, and the establishment of the mercantilist system under the Navigation Acts somewhat hindered that trade, as the materials had to first go to England before they can then be shipped to the Caribbean colonies, which actually increased the cost of these materials. It was much cheaper to import them directly from North America to the Caribbean, of course, a much shorter distance. These issues created a situation that was ripe for exploitation by colonial merchants and shippers who, by and large, ignored or bypassed the Navigation Acts and engaged in large-scale smuggling operations, particularly, again, to the Caribbean. And this is somewhat evidence of this idea of fringe theory, which we explored in our Elements of Historical Theory. Because the colonies were, of course, so far away from the mother country, it was very difficult for the enforcement arm of the English Empire to really enforce these Navigation Acts to a considerable degree. Now, also, around this time, in 1660 of the Common Era, the English created the Royal African Company, which was a joint stock company that was granted a monopoly on English trade with Africa, including the slave trade. And over the course of the next century or so, this aspect of English trade would become increasingly more profitable and increasingly more important to the overall English Empire's economy. English appetite to expand its commercial empire in the 17th century led to the First Anglo-Dutch War, which occurred between 1652 and 1654. And this war was essentially fought over trade. As we talked about previously, the Dutch in the 16th and first half of the 17th century were the most powerful maritime commercial empire in the world, and the English essentially wanted to overtake the Dutch in that preeminent position. To make a long story short, England won the war, and as a result, they gained the territory of New Amsterdam in the Americas in the treaty that ended the war. They renamed New Amsterdam New York after James, the Duke of York, and gained a whole huge new swath of land that would come to compete with New England very shortly. The acquisition of New York brought the English colonists into a collision course with the powerful Iroquois confederacy. Now, the Iroquois Great League of Peace, as the confederacy was known as, was established approximately around 1400 CE, and it was the unification of the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca tribes in the upper New York Great Lakes region there between the border of the modern United States and Canada. These tribes had been fighting with each other for centuries and finally decided to literally bury the hatchet amongst one another and unify to form a greater confederacy that could better defend itself against its neighbors. Now, once they formed this confederacy, they then proceeded to expand that power and project it outwards. Between 1648 and 1657 CE, they engaged in what were known as the Beaver Wars, as the Iroquois sought to expand their territory and gain a greater control of that lucrative fur trade that we've spoke about time and again already in this lecture series. And essentially the result of these wars was that New York was cleared to a large degree of rival Indian groups other than the Iroquois. Now, the rise of Iroquois power led the government of New York into an alliance with the Iroquois that was known as the Covenant Chain. But this alliance actually increased tensions in the region as the Iroquois, the English, and the French all vied for power and control in this region. And as the Iroquois forced those other tribes west, which then had to confront the French presence and the French allied tribes in those regions, which increased the tensions moving westward as well. Now, due to these tensions, the Iroquois eventually adopted a policy of neutrality, or at least attempted to, and they tried to play the English, French, and rival tribes off of each other, all in efforts to maintain this delicate political and diplomatic balance. This image here illustrates some of the dispersal of the populations that were caused by the Beaver Wars of the Iroquois in the mid-17th century. As you can see, the Iroquois engaged in tons of attacks over a huge swath of land and forced all sorts of Indian tribes to move into new territories, which created all new tensions as they, of course, met with other peoples already living in those territories, including, of course, other Native American tribes and the French, who were still a major presence in this region. The mid-17th century also saw the creation of a whole new colony in the southern portion of North America, the colony of Carolina, which originally was one united colony. The division of North and South Carolina did not occur until 1712. The colony of Carolina was initially founded in 1663 when 8 English nobles, who would become known as the Lords Proprietors, were granted a charter by King Charles II to found the colony of Carolina, which was named after King Charles II. Initially, many historians have described the Carolina colony as essentially a colony of a colony, What you see here on this map is a map of the island of Barbados, which was an English colony in the Caribbean at the time. And the rich sugar plantation owners very quickly in Barbados took up all the available productive land in that small island. So they began to look elsewhere as a way to expand their wealth and land holdings, and the founding of the Carolina colony seemed like a great opportunity for them to do so. Many of the Barbadian colonists immigrated into the Carolinas in the late 17th century. The city of Charleston was founded in 1670, and the primary economic activity at the time revolved to a large degree around that trade with local Indians, much as it had been in many other colonies, especially in their early existence. They also employed these Indians in attacks against Spanish Florida. One of the reasons the colony of Carolina was founded to start with was essentially to establish a buffer zone between Spanish Florida and the English colonies a little further north. And they also raided communities of Indians for Indian slaves to sell back to the Caribbean colonies. The Barbadians also imported their slave codes into the Carolinas, and slavery became very quickly a fundamental institution to the economic success of the colony, particularly after rice plantations proved to be a very lucrative economic engine for the Carolina colony in those early years. As was the situation in all of the other colonies, the establishment of the Carolina colony quickly brought the colonists into conflict with the Native Americans of the region. In 1680 to 1682, there was the Westos War against the Westos Indians, what would become South Carolina. It was essentially a conflict over territory. The Tuscarora War, right here in North Carolina, occurred between 1711 and 1715. And again, like the Westos War, was a conflict over territory. Now, this particular conflict saw the North Carolina and South Carolina militias, along with their Catawba, Cherokee, and Yamasee Indian allies, ally against the powerful Tuscarora Indians who had previously held a large part of the control of the territory that would become eastern North Carolina. At the conclusion of that particular war, some of the Tuscarora ended up being put on a small reservation around the Lake Mattamuskeet area, but the majority of them actually immigrated up north and became the sixth tribe of the powerful Iroquois confederacy that we have previously discussed. Around 1715 began what were known as the Yamasee Wars down in South Carolina. Now, as we previously mentioned just a second ago, discussing the Tuscarora War, the Yamasee Indians were initially allies with the colonists and warred on other tribes primarily to obtain slaves to sell to the Carolina colonists, who then sold them on down the line to the West Indies or the Caribbean region. Now, the Yamasee revolted against the Carolina colonists as the colonists actually began enslaving them as well as their rival Indian groups. To make a long story short, the colonists prevailed in this particular war as well, and most of the survivors of the Yamasee Wars were enslaved and sold down to the West Indies or the Caribbean, or escaped to Spanish Florida, which became a haven for not only Indians of the region, but escaped slaves as well, as the Spanish extended amnesty to the slaves that could manage to make it down into their territory in Florida. Brings us to the establishment of the Pennsylvania colony. Now, Pennsylvania was founded in 1681 by this gentleman right here, William Penn, who was granted a charter by the king, who owed Penn's father a debt. So to pay off this debt, he granted Penn a huge swath of land in the eastern North America continent. Now, Penn was a Quaker, and he founded the Pennsylvania colony as what he termed a holy experiment on principles of religious harmony and good relations with the Indians of the region. And in fact, the Native Americans of the region referred to Penn as Great Father. Now, as I mentioned, Penn was a Quaker. Now, the Quakers believed in principles of the equality of all persons, the primacy of individual conscience. They believed in pacifism. They held to a strict moral code, no drunkenness, no swearing, no adultery, and they were also the first abolitionists in America, as they were the very first to speak out against slavery, the slave trade, as an evil stain on all of human society. Initially in Pennsylvania, Penn's Quakers were a majority in the colony, especially because Quakers were not very welcome in most other colonies at the time. But this majority did not last. The low cost of land that Penn put into place in the Pennsylvania colony attracted migrants from all over Europe, particularly in those early years, Germans, and this was the first large influx of Germans into North America, a pattern that would repeat itself moving forward. Now, the non-Quaker migrants came into conflict with the Indians. These people did not adhere to Penn's greater holy mission of living in peace on the same land as the Native Americans, and these non-Quaker migrants demanded access to these Native American Indian lands. Also, the establishment of the Pennsylvania colony shifted the patterns of indentured servitude into that colony as well. As land opened up in Pennsylvania, more opportunities existed for people to establish large farms in the region, which required large amounts of labor, so that attracted more of those indentured servants to Pennsylvania and away from Virginia and Maryland, which caused those regions to rely more and more on slave labor as the indentured servants dwindled in those areas. That concludes the first part of our Chapter 3 lecture. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.